1 million UFO sightings are reported each year. Most can be debunked, but 5% remain unexplained. These are the close encounters. In a small Texas town, friends and fellow farm workers Pedro Saucedo and Joe Salaz head home after a rare night off.
¿Estás seguro que nos tenemos que ir ya, Pedro?
Amigo, ya sabes que solo una cerveza y ya estoy para dormir.
¿Ah? Entonces, ¿por qué no me dejas conducir?
Tus sueños.
Pedro and Joe worked together in the same farm. This was a Saturday night. They were out in Levelland that night enjoying themselves, and they were on their way home.
Levelland, Texas is just what it sounds like. It is level, flat, tabletop.
Hey, necesito que me mantengas despierto.
Te canto una canción.
No, digo que me mantengas despierto, no que me vuelvas loco.
When they left Levelland, they would have been driving west on Farm Road 115. It's fairly isolated, dark. They would have been, fairly alone on the road.
Le dije a Velázquez que se cuide, porque el jefe no la aguanta, mano, pero ¿piensas que me cree? De ninguna, güey. Ese hombre nunca escucha nada.
Cállate, Joe.
Pedro and Joe saw a bright light that first alerted them that there was something unusual nearby.
¿Qué es?
No sé.
They knew it wasn't a planet or a bright star. It was too bright for that. As the light moved closer, they could see that it was an object, not just a light, and it was cylinder-shaped.
Dios mío, ¿qué es esa cosa? Por favor, Pedro, sacanos de aquí. Mira, viene directamente para nosotros.
Joe, cálmate.
Pedro and his buddy naturally got very frightened.
So it's getting closer to them, it's getting bigger.
They're thinking they've got to get out of there. Just when they're about to do that,
Things get a little strange.
Pedro, ¿qué pasa?
No sé.
¿Qué paró?
No sé, no arranca.
Engine stalls. The lights go out.
so now it's completely dark, except of course where they can see the object coming toward them.
¿Qué hace? ¿Se arruinó o qué?
No sé, no quiere arrancar.
This object, this light, was headed right at them, and it was very large.
Pedro, no podemos quedar aquí. Mira esa cosa, ahí está. Ahí está.
Whatever it is, the object is now directly above the stalled truck.
¡Salite!
Pedro, pero no.
Pedro didn't know whether he was being attacked. He didn't know whether it was something personal.
On a dark country road in Texas, Pedro Saucedo and Joe Salaz find themselves on a collision course with a strange bright object that also appears to bring their truck to a dead stop.
Hundreds of times through in UFO history, people have reported their vehicles being affected by UFOs. So Pedro's and Joe's experience here is very consistent with these other reports.
¡Salite de la rueda! ¡Joe! ¡Salite!
Pedro, pero no.
Pedro would be basically running for his life.
Pedro.
Pedro dives out of the truck for protection. Joe Salaz just sits there. He is petrified. He cannot move.
But as Saucedo tries to stay hidden, the object seems to seek him out.
The light becomes very intense. so intense that it's difficult to look at it.
There's a wind or a force or something that comes from the object. Pedro felt heat, he heard a whoosh of sound, and he felt air passing by him like an exhaust system or something from an object.
If we're looking for a terrestrial explanation, we're talking about some kind of a jet engine that puts out an awful lot of heat. It would put out a strong gust of wind. So what you're describing there is a jet engine, in essence.
Then the object rockets into the sky with extreme speed.
This object is flying faster than it's supposed to be at those altitudes.
Pedro gave an estimate of 600 to 800 miles an hour. When Pedro stood up, the object was already moving quickly. I mean, it just kept moving rapidly away.
And they just kind of watch it disappear into the distance.
Ya se fue. Sí. ¿Y qué era esa cosa, mano? No sé. Venite, venite.
And with the craft now out of range, the truck comes back to life.
Saucedo started the engine, and the electrical system began to work again.
The lights came back on, the motor came back on, and they could get on their way and drive off to some place where they felt more safe. They drove to the nearest phone at the next town, and they called the sheriff in Loveland.
Pero no me siento seguro que esa cosa no va a regresar, nos deberíamos largar.
Mira, le tenemos que decir a alguien.
¿A quién? ¿A los militares o qué?
A la policía. Hello? Yes, sir. County Police?
Yes, sir.
I need to report something that happened on I-115.
Are you reporting an accident, sir?
No accident.
Because of who he was, being Hispanic in Texas, being a part-time farmer, they didn't take him seriously. They thought he was seeing things.
It was this big light that almost hit us, going 800 miles an hour. It was just going...
Can you tell me the model?
No, I don't know what it was.
Shortly after the call from Pedro and Joe, the sheriff and his deputy realized that perhaps they should have taken that first report more seriously, because that same night, almost a dozen reports came into the sheriff's office with similar instances of vehicles being affected by UFOs.
The wave of sightings comes to be known as the UFO storm of 1957. On November 2nd, West Texas police received calls from local citizens in at least 13 separate locations. Witnesses include several police officers and a state fire marshal. That same night, similar sightings are reported in White Sands, New Mexico, more than 300 miles away. In all, witnesses throughout the American Southwest reported some 118 sightings in the month of November, 1/3 of those involving vehicle interference. Today, the Levelland sighting is considered the first of dozens of vehicle interference cases reported in 1957.
He was seeing something beyond his frame of reference. He'd never dealt with anything like this.
This is an interaction. He's being attacked.
Near the town of Livingston, Scotland, forestry worker Robert Taylor is carrying out an inspection of the property under his care, like he does every morning.
The Detchment Wood Forest was owned by a housing corporation, and Robert Taylor was one of the key people who looked after this forest. Robert Taylor's duties involved monitoring the forest. He would have to make sure, for example, that fences were properly maintained and that basically everything was running smoothly.
Hey, back. Back, Bunny.
Robert Taylor was a war hero. He had served with distinction in the Second World War as a tank driver. He'd been present at the evacuation at Dunkirk, and he'd been a part of D-Day.
All right, Bunny, out you come. You wish for a day's work. Come on, lass.
Robert Taylor habitually took his dog with him on these sorts of work days. He and his dog went everywhere. The dog was almost part of the team.
Looks like we got trespassers on the property, Bonnie.
Let's keep our eyes open.
I think it's fair to say that he would have known these woods like the back of his hand. He was extremely familiar with them and was an extremely well-respected member of that community.
Robert continues his search for possible trespassers, heading deeper into the forest.
Let's go in here, Lee. Come on.
He'd walked maybe half a mile or so into the woods.
What is it, Bonnie?
And at that point, his dog, which was normally pretty well behaved, started going crazy, barking, acting as if it was in distress.
His dog seems to be reacting to something.
Settle down. See something, buddy? Is there something out there? Hello?
And as he goes a little bit further, he gets to a small clearing.
Hello?
Something attracts his attention, but it's not right in front of him. It's on the other side of the clearing. It's like it's there, and it's not there. It's like there's a distortion in the air. At times he can see the trees at the far side of the clearing, and then at times it looks like there's some indistinct shape blocking out those trees.
He could perhaps be described as like a heat haze shimmer that you would see in the desert.
When all of a sudden the blurriness, the distortion disappears, and he can make out a clear object.
What in God's name?
This is like nothing he's ever seen before in his life.
Robert Taylor has found some kind of intruder in the Detchment Woods, but this is no ordinary trespasser.
Robert Taylor, at that point, thought, this is it. This thing, whatever it is, may kill me.
Forestry worker Robert Taylor goes into the woods with his dog, looking for a suspected trespasser.
What is it, Bonnie?
But a short hike in, he discovers a strange spherical object.
God's name.
He's a war hero. He's a military veteran. He's highly trained, incredibly brave. He doesn't run from this thing. He wants to get a closer look. You can see for the first time what this thing is. And it's a broadly circular shaped object with a kind of rim around it.
He describes this object as being a metallic sphere with protrusions underneath, like could be landing legs.
And he hears this strange noise that appears to be coming from inside this object. It's almost like banging noise.
Stay, Bonnie, stay!
After the object started making these noises, two smaller objects seemed to emerge somehow and came out of the object. They had on them these kind of spikes.
He likens them to like Second World War mines, something which he'd have been very familiar with during his wartime service.
These two small objects come hurtling towards him across the ground. And as the spikes hit the ground, there was this kind of popping sound.
He was seeing something beyond his frame of reference. He'd never dealt with anything like this.
Robert tried to run, but at that point, the two smaller objects basically attached themselves to his legs. The spikes were digging into his trousers. There's a kind of noxious odor that he smells, a really repugnant, acrid smell. He comes to believe that some noxious gas was released. Not only are these objects attached to his trousers, they're now dragging him back towards the main object. Most UFO sightings are just lights in the sky, but this is an interaction. He's being attacked. And at that point, he passed out. Robert Taylor later calculated that he'd been unconscious for around 20 minutes. He could only assume that during that missing 20 minutes, he had been inside this object. When he came to, he tried to get to his feet, but he stumbled. I mean, he was clearly still weak and disorientated. He looked around. The object had gone. But as he examined the clearing, he did find some strange markings. Two different types. Some round holes and some more horizontal lines. Clearly something had been in that clearing. Robert Taylor first decided to try and call for help, and he went to use the radio in his vehicle. But he found that his voice wouldn't come out. He could hardly speak. Robert Taylor assume that the reason that he was unable to speak at this point was that it was an after effect of the noxious substance, the gas, that had been released.
Robert Taylor's bizarre story is not easily dismissed.
Robert Taylor is one of those kind of great witnesses that you find absolutely just tells the truth as it happens. He's the kind of person that you would want on your jury service, not one prone to make up stories.
Police investigate Robert Taylor's sighting, treating his experience with the spiked objects as an assault. A forensic analysis of Robert Taylor's trousers finds tears in the fabric from bottom to top. A finding consistent with the spheres having taken hold of Robert from below. Robert Taylor fully recovers his voice within hours. A medical exam shows no physical abnormalities, but does identify abrasions on his hips, consistent with the tear marks in his trousers. The marks in the dirt are still visible when police investigate the clearing. Subsequent tests on soil samples provide no clear answer as to the cause. Accounts of the incident in the media draw hundreds of curiosity seekers, forcing police to cordon off the area, closing it off from public view.